Hi, everyone. Welcome to this recorded webinar. My name is Jeff Mason, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Helion Technologies. Before we get started, I want to thank the Colorado Auto Dealers Association for allowing us to provide its members with this incredibly important content that we have for you today. If you have any questions about today's presentation, please email them after the presentation to marketing@heliontechnologies.com. I'd now like to introduce today's presenter, Eric Nachbar, founder and president of Helion Technologies. Eric is a certified information system security professional with more than 2 decades of experience working with dealers to secure their data and optimize their IT environments. Today, Helion supports more than 1,000 dealers across the country and the over 30,000 individuals they employ. Eric, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for joining us. Really excited to be here. So let's just jump right into it and talk about cybercrime. Obviously, 2024 was a really big year for cybercrime, and especially in the auto industry, right? We all are very familiar with the CDK attack and the massive downtime that caused. Of course, a lot of other large auto groups were impacted throughout the year with cyber attacks. And if you look at cybercrime globally, it's been exploding. It's projected to be a $23 trillion industry by 2027. And I think it's really important to note that it's an industry, right? A global industry. If you look at the gross domestic product of the United States, we're talking about $30 trillion roughly, right? This is approaching that. So when you think about the increase in cybercrime, right? So roughly 175% increase year over year. The thing you really need to consider is these are not individuals or single hackers in basements, right? That kind of old notion of cyber criminals. This is a worldwide enterprise, right? A worldwide industry and business. You've got in countries such as specifically India, Eastern Europe, China, you've got cyber criminals that operate as businesses. They've got data centers, software developers, social engineers, and they're doing this 24/7, right? So while we might have a webinar here that you're listening to, we're doing some security activities, right? Maybe we have a security operations center monitoring things. These organizations and individuals this is all they do, right? So that's what we're up against. And if you look at the major thing they're doing, and if you look at all of the attacks we saw in 2024, just about all of them were ransomware. So the thing you need to understand is they're really not as concerned about grabbing some names, grabbing some social security numbers. That's certainly they'll opportunistically grab that kind of data. But what they really want to do is lock up your computer system, like they did with CDK, and then demand a ransom, which they got millions and millions of dollars. And I've heard different numbers thrown around there, but I heard something like $28 million, right? The exact number hasn't been released, but that's where all the money is. And so that's the thing today, and that could change, but today, the thing we're looking at is ransomware and then tying up your computer systems and you're paying them some huge ransom. If we look at who's getting targeted, 70% of these ransomwares are targeting small businesses, and a small business is 250 employees or less. It's a similar statistic with medium-sized businesses. So most dealers fall into the range where, that's the main target that they're going after. You are the target. So if we look at some of the tactics and what we're seeing out there, the big one that we're seeing is social engineering. So if you look at where cyber criminals are going, they want to get into your email box. And the best way to get into your email box is to trick you, right? So once they get into your email box, they're able to do a lot of different things, right? An example that we can give you that happened last year is we saw a CFO get tricked into clicking a link, actually got tricked into logging into a website that looked like Microsoft, right? Giving up their username and password, and then actually inputting their current multi-factor authentication token, right? So as you all know, you've received that, right? You've got an app, or a lot of times we get a text that's got a one-time PIN code that lasts very briefly. Well, this CFO got tricked into giving up the one-time PIN code, and then they used that to log into the CFO's mailbox and launched a very sophisticated attack where they found out that that dealership organization was switching payroll providers. They were able to they registered a domain of the payroll provider. They were able to impersonate the actual rep that the person was working with, right, using a fake domain name. They had rules set up in the mailbox to delete out the emails from the actual rep. And ultimately, they got the CFO to wire by putting a lot of pressure. Hey, we need to run payroll. They got the CFO to wire $400,000 to the cyber attackers, and that money was gone. So it's really a combination. And if you look, it's a combination of tactics, but the main ingredient is this social engineering of getting people to act by trickery. So that's what we're seeing primarily happening, and it works very well against really any business, but we're seeing it working well in the dealership world. Another thing that cyber criminals go after, and it's typically, frankly, after they get brought in by some sort of social engineering method, is they go after configuration mistakes. And what that means is it means holes that were left by IT people. What do we see in dealerships, right? We see administrative passwords that go unchanged. We've seen administrative passwords when we go look in the system that haven't been changed for over a decade. We see people with administrative access that don't need to have administrative access. We see, things unlocked on the systems, right? In Windows, in the network infrastructure that shouldn't be unlocked. So holes that are glaring that the cyber criminals are able to, use and leverage to get into the system. They're leveraging AI. That is harder to observe on the front end, but on the back end, if you look, an example of AI, because it can process huge amounts of data. If we go back to that example of the social engineering and how they were able to trip up and rob this business through tricking the CFO into clicking things, they are sending out massive amounts of phishing emails. So they're sending out emails that lure people into clicking on things, and then they monitor all of that with AI. So that if they see a click through, they see that type of behavior, that immediately gets them put in front of a group of people that can launch an attack. You look at that example that I just gave of attacking the CFO. There were numerous, professionals involved in running that attack and tricking them into wiring the money. So they're using AI to identify, when an attack is possible. The newest tactic we're seeing, and that is coming into the play, is EDR killers. So EDR is the technology that allows security operations centers to monitor your system. So what that looks like is you've got software, as one example, running on your computer that monitors the logs of things that are happening on your computer. And if something suspicious happens, like a cyber attacker trying to penetrate the system, or they've already gotten brought in by, phishing somebody and getting them to load it into the system or getting them access, EDR is what notifies the security operations center that something suspicious is going on. And then that allows the security professionals to react. Well, these EDR killers are actually going into the system and blocking the communication back to the security operations center. So they're actually going into the operating system, right? So they're going into Windows, because it's very difficult to shut down these EDR software. They're made to prevent shutdowns, right, by attackers. But the attackers have figured out, hey, we can't shut down the software. Let's go into Windows and shut down the communication of that software. So that's the level of sophistication that these cyber criminals are using. And the tactics, they're very difficult to fight. So that's what we're dealing with today. So as you're thinking about, okay, how do we protect our dealership from cybercrime? That's what you have to think about, right, as security professionals, and what you need to be aware of as a business executive, right, as you're looking at all of this. So what is the challenge specifically in the dealership world when we're dealing with cybercrime? Well, we've got some kind of cultural issues that I would say exist, and we all can agree that this is how it is in the dealership world, right? But I've seen this, and it's changing some. But the big items are, right, minimizing the importance of IT, minimizing the importance of security, and then not misunderstanding what compliance looks like, right, and what we want to measure when it comes to compliance. Mistaking compliance tools for cybersecurity. So, when we look at what compliance looks like, right, what cybersecurity looks like, and what we're supposed to be measuring, what we've seen in the industry is, and this specifically happened when FTC safeguards got relaunched because it already existed, is we saw a lot of compliance organizations, we saw a lot of products come into the marketplace that really were self-reporting checklists, right? Hey, do you have multi-factor authentication? Oh, yes, I do. I know we turned that on. Well, we're not really looking to ensure that we can check some box. If you look at what we're trying to do, we're trying to make sure that, does everyone actually have multi-factor authentication turned on? And what we typically are finding is we don't. You might have it turned on a global level, but people don't have multi-factor turned on. So there's a misunderstanding of what compliance looks like and what it's supposed to be doing. And then, fundamentally, there's just a lack of qualified resources, right? So historically, we've seen in the auto industry that, the IT person, well-meaning, but typically is the former parts person, the former marketing person, maybe the BDC manager, maybe the CFO, maybe the controller, maybe a salesperson that enjoyed IT, service advisor that got into IT, a lot porter that is, I've seen that more than once, a lot porter that handles the IT. So and even if we've got a good IT department with solid IT skills, they're not necessarily security experts, and typically they're not. Those are two separate disciplines. So what that results in, right, is this unqualified and overburdened resources, right? So people that have responsibility for IT, but then are also getting, saddled with cybersecurity and compliance, and that's not what they know. At best they know IT. So you've got these other areas that, you know, either the IT people that are day-to-day operational people are responsible for, or worse, we're seeing people that this stuff is getting thrown into the accounting department and somebody, getting dumped on somebody to say, hey, figure out our compliance and make sure we fill out all these checklists, right? So where does that leave us? Well, the actual cybersecurity vulnerabilities are going unaddressed. So, sure, people are filling out check boxes, saying they have things, thinking they're compliant, thinking they're secure, and the reality is they've got vulnerabilities that, generally speaking, right, if you look in the entire cybersecurity world, 75% of cyber attacks are exploiting vulnerabilities that were discovered years ago, right, and are unaddressed. So if you look at in the dealership world, you know, assuming that these questionnaires are getting answered correctly, and assuming maybe you plugged a box into your network and it's doing what it's supposed to, which we typically don't see it doing what it's supposed to, where does all of that go, right? Who is instructing IT and the business operations on what type of adjustments need to happen, right, to increase cybersecurity? That's not happening in our industry, and frankly, that's typical of everywhere. So what do we see, right? This is what I'm talking about. These do-it-yourself solutions, which I use the word solution, broadly, that dealers are purchasing, and it's this delusion of a quick fix. Hey, I got to comply with these federal regulations. I'm going to buy a software product, an online portal that asks me a bunch of questions and spits out a bunch of policy documents, and there's this delusion that for a couple $100 a month per store, I'm just going to be secure and compliant. And if you think about that, it just does not make sense, right? So now dealers have this false sense of security. When I talk to dealers, they say, "Oh yeah, we're secure, we're compliant." Well, what makes you say that? Well, I've filled out these checklists. I've subscribed to a compliance product, so I'm good to go. And that's what we're seeing across the industry is this false sense of security, where this kind of illusion of compliance exists when really, it's just a bunch of products that got purchased that either are ineffective or they're not put in place, right? So, hey, I've bought a multi-factor authentication product. I've bought a scanning product, and the products either aren't working or they're not put in place, and the money is wasted. That's where we are in the industry, unfortunately. So, where that leaves us is really with a siloed approach, right? So you've got IT. So those are the folks that are doing the day-to-day operations, right? Plugging in computers, helping people that need assistance with something, right? IT is not a security focused area. Sure, you're setting up user accounts, you're making sure that they're set up correctly, you're setting up multi factor authentication, but there's really typically no cybersecurity expertise that is broad and understands what are the current tactics cyber criminals are using. What are the new methodologies we should be putting in place, right? How do we monitor the system to ensure that cyber criminals aren't breaching the system? What do we do when cyber criminals start to penetrate and probe the system? Can we see that? That is cybersecurity. That is not IT. And dealers across the board typically only have IT. What is compliance? Compliance is not about regulations. Compliance is about, are the things we're doing in IT, right? The things we're setting up, are the cybersecurity protocols, the things we're expecting, right? Multi-factor authentication on every user account. I keep going back to that because it's something that we see all the time, right? People with administrative rights, people with remote access. Compliance should be looking at that and drawing out things that are wrong, right? Or things that we need to adjust. That's what compliance is all about. And if you look at what's the solution, okay, it's what the FTC says. So I'm not an FTC advocate broadly, right? So you can think what you want about the FTC, but when it comes to their safeguards and what they're insisting and demanding that businesses do that handle consumer information is they say institutions must develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program to safeguard customer data. Okay, that actually makes sense. They're not saying anything unreasonable. And that's something that has been lacking in our industry, right? And so checklists and things like that are not developing, implementing, and maintaining a comprehensive information security. That's what we're supposed to do. And what does that drive, right? What is the FTC driving with that fundamental notion? Well, they're driving dealerships to do the right thing, right? We need to protect consumer data. But I would tell you that more importantly, right? More importantly than protecting consumer data, it's preventing cybersecurity breaches, right? It is securing the data and it is improving IT performance, right? So when you set things up correctly, data's protected, the system runs better, but ultimately you're preventing cybersecurity breaches. That's the intent of the FTC safeguards. Forget about everything else. The FTC safeguards, FTC rules are, in other areas. The safeguards is specifically to protect your business, and they're telling you how to protect your business with standards. So if you look at what a software, right? So what is and isn't compliant? Well, software or a web portal is not compliance, right? Compliance involves planning. So, what do I need to do to protect my system, right? What do I currently have? So, if you look at safeguards, it says, hey, you need to have an annual review where you look at what do you have, what do you need to be adjusting, what's currently happening in the cyber, security world, what are the new tactics, right? So, we need to plan out what we're going to do. There needs to be a technical effort. So that planning involves adjusting the system, right? It might be involving, putting new technologies in place or tightening things down, applying patches, right? Refreshing things. So there's going to be technical effort that requires security expertise. You have to monitor the system, right? So the big thing that we see is, MFA gets turned on, right? Multi-factor authentication, where, for example, to log into DMS or to log into, Microsoft 365 or Google Workplace, you have to have multi-factor authentication. But we're seeing, when we look at that from a compliance standpoint, that user accounts are set up where the users never log in, right? And they're set up with a default password that then attackers could take over. MFA is overridden where certain people don't want to deal with multi-factor authentication. So you got to monitor the system from a compliance standpoint and say, hey, are these things actually happening? And you have to continuously evaluate the system, right? To see, are the most current security activities and security requirements in place? And yes, there is a documentation component of that, but documenting things that you think are in place is not compliance, right? Documenting things and reporting on things that are happening, right? Whether the system is compliant or not compliant, needs to change and be adjusted to be compliant. That's what we want to document. And ultimately, that rolls into continuous improvement, right? So we need to continuously adjust and update the system based on what we're seeing, both to implement new things, but also to ensure that the things we have in place are working and improving those and getting more compliance, right? That's what compliance is and isn't. So that's what I want you to be thinking about as you're thinking about your security this year, right? It's not about checking boxes and generating documentation. It's all of those other activities. And so ultimately, we have to evolve beyond these silos, right? The silo of IT service, cybersecurity, which typically we're seeing dealers are installing some software and it's not really in any way interfacing with security operations or security professionals. And then this administrative function of compliance, which really goes beyond administration, right? It really needs to be looking at what's happening in IT, what's happening in cybersecurity, are the things we're expecting, right? When we inspect the system, is the system doing what we're expecting, right? And that's the primary function of compliance, right? So this siloed approach doesn't work. They all need to be integrated. And if we look at that, right, that is what I call IT nirvana, right? If you look at what the definition is of nirvana, yes, it's this kind of state of peacefulness and happiness, but a key element of reaching nirvana is freedom from delusion. And if you look at our industry, the delusion is this delusion of compliance, and more importantly, this delusion of security, right? Because I fill out some checklists, I get some paperwork spit out, and now I'm compliant. When the reality is, how could you possibly have cybersecurity, right? If you're not truly evaluating it. So to me, nirvana is freedom from delusion that a quick fix exists to create true cybersecurity and peace of mind and safety, right? It requires actual legwork of IT working together with proactive initiatives, right? Which is what FTC is telling us, this plan, working together with cybersecurity operations. So it's not just installing some software or checking some boxes, it's having actual professionals monitoring the system and being able to take action. And then compliance is monitoring that those things are actually taking place and helping them evolve. That's what nirvana, in the safeguard world means to me, right? There's no quick fix to it, and that's what you need to be thinking about. So, what are the things that need to happen to reach nirvana, right? What are the activities? Well, software, and I'm only giving you a group of them, right? So I'm going to tell you 8 different things. There's a lot more, but this gives you some sense of what needs to be happening. You got to have software configuration management, right? So making sure that Windows is set up in a secure way that people can't just easily break in. And that's constantly changing. To give you one example, you know, in 2025, in October 2025, Windows 10 is going end of life. So that means Microsoft is no longer going to release updates, right? Security fixes. You have to be on Windows 11 by the end of this year. That's an example, right? So you need to have a plan for that. Cyber threat hunting really involves having active AI looking at the system, analyzing logs, and then when things are found that are suspicious, that gets passed on to experts, right? And that goes over to the next side, cyber attack identification, which I'll talk about next. Vulnerability management is really about doing scans, but then taking action based on those scans. So oftentimes we see organizations, they'll run scans, they'll run pen tests where human assessors look at things and they'll dump out a report. They say, great, I did a pen test, I did a vulnerability scan. Let me put that report in a file. Now I'm good to go. No. When pen testers or vulnerability scanners actually run those tests, they need to draw out what are the actual big things that we need to remediate. And typically we see just a huge list of things dumped off on a dealership, and it'll include things like, hey, your thermostat that is a internet connected thermostat is not running the most current software. Who cares? That doesn't matter. That's not a risky area, but we might see holes open up in the firewall for remote access. That's a huge risk area. So those are things we need to address, right? That's a huge part. User access management, right? The big thing there is people changing passwords, multi-factor being in place, and administrative access being restricted. Well, These are things that are not monitored in dealerships. An example of what we find is we'll look at dealerships and we'll find, in large organizations, we found hundreds of user accounts of people that either never started with the organization or were no longer with the organization that were still active. Identifying cyber attacks as they're starting, right? Because we can assume that attackers are going to get into the system. Well, how do I identify them quickly? Do we have technology in place that is monitoring the system? And importantly, what happens when an attack is identified by, the technology that's monitoring the system? We're seeing IT departments saying, oh, we're buying a product like CrowdStrike. Well, great. When something comes up, who's looking at that and saying, oh, okay, this is actually something we really need to look at? There's nobody with security expertise. Typically, it's not monitored 24/7, right? So that's a huge part of Nirvana. It's not plugging in some box and hoping that, what happens with that box? What's it supposed to be doing, right? Again, this delusion of security. There needs to be strategic planning and analysis. So if you're going into a web portal and clicking a button that dumps out your annual cybersecurity report, delusion, that's impossible, right? You actually need to assess the system, right? People that know what they're assessing need to assess the system, analyze how your system currently is, compare that to what's happening in the cybercrime industry, and then planning out what needs to change and then executing on that. You need to have a defensive network architecture. So what that means is having technology in place that adapts, that patches itself. An example would be Cisco Meraki, right? So that's network infrastructure that if it's configured correctly, it's actually going to update itself and keep itself more secure. That's part of what you subscribe to with Cisco is they analyze the system, they look at what attackers are going after, and they actually release updates that attack the network, that defend the network infrastructure, but also defend your technology that sits behind the firewall, right? And configures the system to thwart attacks that are going after the systems behind the firewall. That's what we're talking about, a defensive network architecture. And then cyber attack remediation. So when a cyber attack starts, right, assuming we identify it, do we have security professionals, not typically IT people, but security professionals that can instruct IT people on what to do to get the attackers out and then to keep them out, right? And to adjust the system, based on what we saw them doing to prevent that type of attack again. So these are just 8 things that are involved in reaching IT nirvana. So you want to ask yourself when you look at your organization, do you have these things in place, right? And so when you think about peace of mind, it ultimately comes down to, can you develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program? Not can you check a few boxes of self-reporting. Have you actually looked into your system? Have you identified what's there? And with expertise, do you have a program that you're going to use to continuously update the system? And if you look at the annual board report that the FTC requires, it really means that security professionals are looking at the system, your system specifically, and evaluating what needs to happen to implement and maintain a comprehensive information security program, right? How do we need to continue to adapt that? So here's a few questions that you can ask. And these are simple questions. Whoever's running your IT or running your security operations, or if you've got compliance companies in place, these are the questions you need to ask to whoever that person is, right? Hopefully you have somebody that's the qualified individual, right? So that's a trained, certified person who gets continuing education in cybersecurity operations, who's responsible for your system, right? So it's not somebody checking boxes in a web portal. Ask the qualified individual these questions. And this is obviously not exhaustive. I could come up with 100 more questions, but here's some to give you a sense that should be able to be explained to you and easy to understand. Who monitors the system and who responds if there's a security incident, right? So security incident is something that's suspicious. It doesn't need to be something where something was stolen or something's happening, that is disrupting the system. If something suspicious happens, who sees that and how do they respond to it? That's a key question. Who is that? Do you know, right? Do you know what their response capabilities are? There's a question you can ask. Is the system monitored 24/7? And is there response involved? So typically cyber attackers go after systems on weekends, on holidays, in the middle of the night, right? Wherever you are, because that's when you're going to have the weakest response or no response. So the question is your system monitored for probing or attack by cyber criminals after hours, right? 24/7, and what response capability it exists, right? So can your security operations center, whoever's monitoring the system, presumably 24/7, can they reach into the system? If they see an attacker logging into PCs and attempting to log into servers after hours, and launching an attack, can your security operations center reach in and actually shut things down, or kick the criminals out, or actually launch a response, right? Do you have that capability in place now, or is it just a box that's doing some sort of scanning? Security training is a big thing. When our compliance looks at security training completion, we typically find that dealers have anywhere from 30 to 60% adherence to security training. So we're finding that in dealerships that have security training in place, which we do find that most have some sort of security product, most employees are not actually completing the security training. And if you remember that most of these attacks are getting launched through social engineering, right? Typically via phishing email, and then getting people. If you remember the CFO example I talked about in the beginning, right? People getting tricked into allowing attackers into the system. Training is the big thing that helps, excuse me, prevent that. Do you know what percentage of your employees have been trained? That number should be in front of you, right? And you should be taking action on people that aren't doing the training and insisting they do the training. So what percentage of employees have completed training? That number should be at your fingertips and should be able to be provided easily. The next one I would tell you to ask is, can employees install software on their PC? Once the attackers get a foothold in the system, the big thing they want to be able to do is install software that ultimately will allow them to lock out the system and ransom you. If employees can install software on their PC, that can point to their ability to install software on other parts of the system. And we've absolutely seen where key employees, and that's usually where it is, right? Executives will have administrative rights onto the entire system on their login that they're using day to day. So if their system gets compromised, right, their PC gets compromised, the attackers can get into the entire system. So a question you can ask is, can people install software? If they can, even on their local PC, they have more access than you want them to have. And that opens the door for attackers. The next one you can ask is, have we upgraded all of our PCs to Windows 11? Do you have a report that shows you how many PCs have Windows 11, how many PCs have Windows 10? And by the way, you need to have a certain chip on the PC to be able to run Windows 11. So even if you have Windows 10 machines, not all of them can be upgraded to Windows 11. So you should have a very clear, visibility into, is everything upgraded to Windows 11? And if not, what still needs to happen? I can warn you that if you wait till the last minute, which we saw the same thing in 2019 with Windows 7 going to Windows 10, right? When they retired Windows 7 and everybody would be on Windows 10, PCs became scarce and expensive. So don't wait until September or October to upgrade to Windows 11. We had clients that waited, and it turned out that they weren't up on Windows 11 for months, right? Because ultimately PCs get scarce, they get more expensive, and the resources get overloaded to move you to Windows 11. So these are 5 questions that you can answer that don't require a bunch of technical skill, that you should be able to very easily get straight answers, right? These things should be in place. So there's a quick assessment you can perform for yourself. Obviously, since this webinar is recorded, we're not going to be able to take questions. However, you can certainly ask your questions, right? If you have more questions. So you can email me directly. There's my email address. You can call me. There's my direct number if you want to discuss what your specific situation is or ask specific questions. If you want a copy of these slides, you can email heliontechnologies.com and you know, you can copy the slides, and you can certainly ask questions there as well. So hopefully that wasn't too much for you. I know I talk nonstop, but this is obviously an area that I'm very passionate about, and I think you really need to spend some time on. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
Thanks so much, Eric. That concludes today's webinar. Again, if you have any questions, you can feel free to email Eric directly or email marketing@heliontechnologies.com. And thank you all so much for your time and for joining us today. Thank you.